That's what we call addiction. When somebody pursues a drug or an activity that leads to huge increases in dopamine, drug addiction, alcohol addiction, and behavioral addictions, such as gambling and sex addiction, as well as other types of addiction. Learned that there are a huge range of behaviors and substances to which people can become addicted to. I know people in my life that are still talking about this one relationship, this one person that was just so great despite all the challenges of that thing, that it's almost like they're addicted to the narrative. Yeah. It could be to any number of things: video games, sex, right, gambling, a person, a narrative. That there's a common path to the treatment and recovery from essentially all addictions. One person is triggered by social interactions, another person is triggered by spiders, but the underlying response is identical. There may be some nuance, but that they're sort of a core set of processes. Nature did not evolve 20 different mechanisms for 20 different types of addiction. It doesn't really matter if it's gambling or video games or sex or a narrative about a previous lover or partner or whatever. It's the same addictive process underneath that. Many people who become addicted to things have this feeling that normal life isn't interesting enough, that they are seeking a super normal experience, and that the day-to-day routine, balance, that the word balance itself can sometimes be a bit of an aversive term for people. So much of what I see online is about generating a lack of balance, about being tilted forward at all times, really leaning into life hard, experiencing life, living a full life, finding passion, digging, that's so much in the narrative now. That all speaks to the kind of generalizability of our brain circuitry. That when you experience something or you crave something really desirable, really exciting to you, very pleasurable, what happens afterwards is your baseline level of dopamine drops. This is why when you repeatedly engage in something that you enjoy, your threshold for enjoyment goes up and up and up. We all hear that dopamine is this molecule associated with pleasure. I think the term dopamine hits, like I'm getting a dopamine hit from this, from Instagram or from likes or from praise or from whatever, is now commonly heard. But actually, there's no such thing as a dopamine hit. And actually, the way that your body uses dopamine is to have a baseline level of dopamine, meaning an amount of dopamine that's circulating in your brain and body all the time. And that turns out to be important for how you feel generally. When you might think, oh, a big peak in dopamine, after that, I'm going to feel even better because I just had this great event. Not the case. What actually happens is that your baseline level of dopamine drops. Our nervous system tends to generate particular kinds of behaviors based not on time, but on our state. How much dopamine you experience from something depends on your baseline level of dopamine when you arrive there and your previous dopamine peaks. The dopamine is really stimulating, but then what happens is it doesn't have that same fulfilling aspect to it. And it tends to remove the excitement and the pleasure of the very activities that we are engaged in. We are incredibly habitual organisms. Unless we intervene in our habits, they tend to carry out the same way that they always have once they've formed. Habits are things that our nervous system learned, but not always consciously. Sometimes we develop habits that we're not even aware of until they become a problem. In fact, it's estimated that up to 70% of our waking behavior is made up of habitual behavior. We are very habitual. And we tend to do things more or less over and over in the same way unless we intervene in ourselves. That's just the way that we are wired. Now, in order to break synapses or to break apart neural connections that are serving a habit that you don't want to engage in, we need to engage the process called long-term depression. And long-term depression has nothing to do with a state of mental depression or a reduction in mood. So how do you take two neurons that underlie a habit out of synchrony? What actually has to happen is bringing conscious awareness to the period immediately afterward, which I think most people recognize. They realize, oh, I just did it again. Let's say you tell yourself you're not going to pick up your phone, you're not going to bite your nails, you're not going to reflexively walk to the refrigerator at a particular time of day, but you find yourself doing it anyway. And in that moment, capture the sequence of events, not that led to the bad habit execution, but actually to take advantage of the fact that the neurons that were responsible for generating that bad habit were active a moment ago, and to actually engage in a replacement behavior immediately afterward. The stage or the period immediately after the bad habit execution is a unique opportunity to insert a different type of what we would call adaptive behavior, but that could be any behavior that's not in line with the bad behavior. You will be amazed at the tremendous number of positive effects that can come from that. Simple tool, but very powerful tool according to the psychology literature. So that's remarkable to me, and the literature is really robust. There are a couple of tools that neuroscience and psychology tell us can be very beneficial. Some of those things are somewhat intuitive and relate to what I call foundational practices, meaning things that set the overall tone in your body and brain. So things like stress reduction, things like getting good sleep, things like quality nutrition, things like having positive routines arranged throughout your day. All of those, of course, will support you in trying to break particular habits. With each repetition of a habit, small changes occur in the cognitive and neural mechanisms associated with procedural memory. And anytime we're talking about habits, that means our nervous system learns something. The nervous system can be reflexive in its action, or it can be deliberate. This is very important to understand if you're going to think about tools to improve your nervous system, whether or not that tool is in the form of a chemical that you decide to take, a brain-machine device, or you're going to try and learn something better by engaging in some focus or motivated pursuit for some period of time each day. So we have sensation, then we have perception. Perception is our ability to take what we're sensing and focus on it and make sense of it, to explore it, to remember it. So really, perceptions are just whichever sensations we happen to be paying attention to at any moment. While sensation is not negotiable, you can't change your receptors unless you adopt some new technology. Perception is under the control of your attention. And you can do this right now. You can experience perception and the difference between perception and sensation very easily. If, for instance, I tell you to pay attention to the contact of your feet, the bottoms of your feet, with whatever surface they happen to be in contact with. The moment you place your, what we call the spotlight of attention or the spotlight of perception on your feet, you are now perceiving what was happening there, what was being sensed there. The sensation was happening all along, however, and that's because we have something in our nervous system which is sort of like a two-way street. And that two-way street is a communication between the aspects of our nervous system that are reflexive and the aspects of our nervous system that are deliberate. And that's because your nervous system basically wired up to be able to do most things easily without much metabolic demand, without consuming much energy. But the moment you try and do something very specific, you're going to feel a sort of mental friction. If reflexive action tends to be what we call bottom up, Deliberate action and deliberate perceptions and deliberate thoughts are top down. They require some effort and some focus, but that's the point. You can decide to focus your attention and energy on anything you want. You can decide to focus your behavior in any way you want. I would imagine that being able to derive pleasure from many things would be a wonderful attribute. We know people like this that can experience pleasure in little things and in big events. Addiction is a progressive narrowing of the things that bring you pleasure. Enlightenment is a progressive expansion of the things that bring you pleasure.